History in print. Every story you're about to hear is real.
Good evening. This is History in Print. Tonight, Dodge City, Kansas. The year is 1876. Wind never stops on the southern Kansas plain. It comes flat off the prairie, carrying dust and the smell of cattle and the faint iron scent of the railroad. Front Street is unpaved. The buildings are raw timber, some not yet painted. At night, the saloons burn with oil light. During the day, the cattle pens hold thousands of longhorns brought up from Texas on the Chisholm Trail. The Santa Fe Railroad has given this town a reason to exist. This is not simply a cattle town. It is a place where the law is still being invented, where the men who enforce it are chosen one week and gone the next, where the Dodge City Times prints the names of its officials as though listing them plainly might hold them in place. March 24th, 1877, the Dodge City Times published its official city directory. It was a short list, the kind any growing town would print. But one name on that list would outlast every building on Front Street. The directory named L.E. Deeger as city marshal. It named George M. Hoover as mayor and Harry E. Gryden as city attorney. And beneath the marshal's name, in the same plain type as everything else, it listed his deputy. His name was Wyatt Earp. He was not yet a legend. He was a young man with a badge in one of the most dangerous towns on the American frontier. The paper listed him without ceremony, one name among several. The directory is what the archive actually preserves, not the myth, the name in print on a March morning in 1877. Dodge City in the spring of 1877 was not a town that rewarded hesitation. Cattle drives were coming. Everyone knew it. Tens of thousands of longhorns moving north out of Texas, and behind them, the drovers. Men who had been riding hard for weeks and arrived in Dodge City with money, thirst, and no particular interest in keeping the peace. The town needed someone willing to stand between that force and the people trying to build something permanent on the Kansas frontier. That man, as the directory made clear, was Wyatt Earp. He was in his mid-20s. He had worked as a lawman before in Wichita, and he had developed a reputation not for being the fastest draw, but for being the coldest nerve. On March 24, 1877, the Dodge City Times printed his name in black ink alongside the other men charged with holding this town together. Above him stood Marshal L.E. Deeger. Deeger was the man whose name appeared first in the directory, the senior lawman, the one whose authority Earp served beneath. The city had placed its faith in both of them. The directory also named Mayor George M. Hoover and City Attorney Harry E. Gryden. They were not frontier outlaws. They were civic officials, men trying to make Dodge City function as a proper municipality, not merely survive as a way station for cattle and violence. The railroad was there. The commerce was real. What was not yet settled was whether law could keep pace with all of it. What the papers didn't print was how thin the margin truly was. Deputy Marshal in Dodge City was not a figurehead. He walked Front Street at night. He stepped into rooms where the odds were rarely in his favor. The title in the directory was 3 words. The work behind it was something else entirely. The record does not say what Earp's first act as Deputy Marshal was. It does not record his first night on duty, or what he found when he walked out onto that plank sidewalk under the open Kansas sky. What it records is the name. In Dodge City, In 1877, that was enough to begin. St. Francis Xavier's Church stood on West 16th Street in New York City. Sunday in late March of 1877, it was filled to capacity. Men, women, and children crowded into the pews, the gas lamps burning warm against the high vaulted ceiling above them. The priest at the pulpit that morning was Father Largiac. Mid-sermon, the subject he had chosen was hell and the horrors of the damned. It is not difficult to imagine the weight in that room. Packed congregation, ornate columns rising overhead, the close air of hundreds of bodies pressed together, and a preacher's voice describing eternal suffering. Then a young woman in the west gallery fainted. She let out a hysterical scream as she fell. The congregation rose to its feet. In the next instant, someone cried, "Fire!" Largiac stopped his sermon immediately. He implored the congregation to keep their seats. Father Merrick, the pastor of the church, rushed into the sanctuary himself, shouting that there was no fire, that there was nothing to fear. The sexton moved through the crowd, struggling to hold the tide back. None of it was enough. The stampede had already begun. Hundreds of people pressing toward narrow exits all at once, the crush building faster than any voice could stop it. The Dodge City Times reported the account on March 24, 1877, reprinting the dispatch from New York and calling the resulting calamity one of the most sorrowful affairs to emerge from that city. Died. Here's what the archive actually reveals. Sermon on Hell had not caused the panic. One person's scream had not caused the panic. What killed those people was a single word, spoken by someone the record never identifies, in a room where escape was already impossible. The church did not burn. Never had. The Dodge City Times had carried the story more than 1,500 miles west, to a frontier cattle town that understood sudden violence. Readers knew what it meant when a crowd moved faster than reason. They had seen it themselves. In the southern Italian city of Salerno, a young woman had everything. She had beauty, education, and a fortune that most could never imagine. Her name was Miss Vernieri. She was barely past her teens, and she was heir to 120,000 ducats, roughly 500,000 lire. Her father was gone. Her mother, now widowed, was left to navigate the world alone. To that vulnerability stepped the family physician. His name was Dr. Casamati. He was a man who styled himself a protector of the widow, of the daughter, of the household entire. Record suggests he was protecting something else. What was at stake was control. Italian law, a husband who married Miss Vernieri would gain legal mastery over her estate. Dr. Casamati understood this precisely, and so according to a correspondent writing from Rome, whose account was printed in the London Daily News and carried thereafter in the Dodge City Times on October 14, 1876, he went to work. Eligible suitors came forward, as they would for an heiress of her standing. Driven away, systematically, every marriage offer that arrived was turned aside. The doctor had her mother completely under his influence. The courtship of Miss Vernieri did not advance past the threshold of her own home. Then she reached her majority. When a young woman gained legal standing over her own affairs, the moment the fortune could finally become hers, Dr. Casamati acted. Miss Vernieri was abducted. She was shut away in an asylum for lunatics. The iron bars, the thick stone walls, the sun in the courtyard below, just out of reach. It was her world now. The Dodge City Times printed the dispatch without editorial comment. It needed none. The facts arranged themselves into their own verdict. Here's what the archive actually reveals. The record does not say what became of her, whether she was freed, whether the doctor faced consequence, whether her fortune.
Every word you just heard came from the original newspapers. Subscribe to History in Print, a new story from the American